Alright, I watched Disney's new Snow White, and let's just say, it's not quite the fairy tale you remember. They made a lot of changes, some bold, some just plain confusing, and it definitely left me with thoughts. Quick heads up, this video does contain spoilers for Disney's new Snow White. If you're still planning to watch it and want to go in totally fresh, maybe hit pause and come back later. Otherwise, let's get into it. The movie opens with a classic storybook shot. And honestly, I kind of love that. It's a nice little nod to old school Disney, and even though it's simple, it definitely sets the fairy tale tone right away. We get a narrator explaining that the king and queen desperately want a child, and one night during this intense snowstorm, they're blessed with a daughter. They name her Snow White, not because of her appearance, but because of the snowstorm itself. Now, I get what they were going for here. It's a more modern take on her name, and maybe an attempt to shift focus away from the original description. You know, skin white as snow, which has been part of the conversation around casting from the beginning. But I'll be honest, the logic felt a little shaky. Especially since we're told the queen was already pregnant before the storm even started. It makes the name feel more symbolic than literal, which is fine, but it might not land for everyone. That said, I do appreciate that they were trying to give her name a little more narrative meaning, even if I personally found it a bit thin. What could they have done differently? Personally, I think they had a real opportunity to deepen her origin in a way that connected more with the rest of the story. Maybe Snow White could have been adopted during the storm, found outside the castle, abandoned, mysterious. That could have added an identity angle later in the plot, especially since the movie leans into her journey of figuring out who she is. Or even just keeping the original line. Skin white as snow, lips red as blood, hair black as ebony. But framing it more poetically or metaphorically, rather than literally. That way, they wouldn't have to dance around the name, and it could still feel intentional. After the opening narration, we move into a short sequence showing Snow White as a child. These early scenes are meant to establish her upbringing, and we see that she's raised with kindness and warmth. Her parents, the king and queen, are portrayed as generous rulers. They spend time with the townspeople, hand out food, dance in the streets. It's very idealized, but in a way that feels purposeful. There's a scene where Snow White helps deliver pies to the villagers, and it's clear they're trying to show her being shaped into someone thoughtful and compassionate. She also has a few quiet moments where she expresses doubt, mostly about whether she'll ever live up to her parents' example. Visually, this part of the movie is soft and warm. Lots of golden light, flowing costumes, and these almost storybook-like town scenes that feel intentionally nostalgic. And to be fair, it's a nice contrast to what's coming later. I liked this part. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was sweet. The pacing was slow, but in a way that gave the story room to breathe. And I appreciated that. It gave us time to connect with the younger version of Snow White before things start to unravel. Now, while I appreciated the softness of these early scenes, I do wish we got just a bit more depth. The movie shows us that Snow White is kind and her parents are beloved, but it all feels very surface level. We get the idea of their bond, but not much dialogue or interaction to really feel it. Personally, I would have loved one or two more meaningful moments between Snow White and her parents, something small but emotionally specific. A bedtime story, a personal lesson, maybe even just a quiet scene of the queen comforting Snow White when she's scared or unsure. Those are the kinds of moments that stick with you, and they would have made what happens next hit even harder. Especially since her parents' deaths are kind of rushed through. The emotional payoff could have been stronger if we were given a little more time to feel that relationship. So, of course, since it's a Disney movie, Snow White's mother falls ill and dies early on. That part's expected. But she's not motherless for long. Pretty soon, her father remarries. And not just anyone. a mysterious woman shows up out of nowhere and is instantly welcomed into the palace. We're told she's so beautiful, it's given her magical powers. And I'll be honest, that part kind of threw me. Like, is magic common in this kingdom? Because no one really reacts. There's no fear, no hesitation, not even a raised eyebrow. The villagers, the palace staff, even the king, they just accept it. No one seems remotely concerned that this woman might be a little too good to be true. And speaking of the king, this is supposed to be the guy we're told is just noble, kind, basically the perfect ruler. But I struggled a bit with that. He goes from mourning his wife to marrying this woman almost immediately. The movie doesn't give us much time to understand why. There's no sense that he's doing it for Snow White's sake, or that he's under some kind of spell, or even that he's just lonely. It really does feel like he married her because she was beautiful. It doesn't make sense how this man is a wise and fair king. Once the queen is in charge, everything in the palace changes. The halls feel colder, the lighting is darker, and Snow White basically becomes invisible. She's not treated like a princess anymore. She's more of a quiet servant, cleaning, staying out of the way, and being watched constantly. There are a few moments that hint at how isolated Snow White feels. She looks out at the village below, but she's not allowed to visit. She listens more than she speaks. And when she finally sneaks out on her own, it's brief. Just enough to remind us that the townspeople still love her. Then there's the mirror scene. The queen steps into her private chamber and speaks to this glowing, almost alien-looking magical surface. Definitely not the classic mirror. She doesn't ask who's fairest. She asks who's most admired. That shift in wording says a lot. This version of the queen isn't just jealous of beauty. She wants power, attention, loyalty. She wants to be chosen. I think this was one of the more effective parts of the movie. The tension is real, and the performances are pretty strong here. But I still wished we got more from Snow White. We see her being quiet and obedient, but not much of her internal world. I wanted to know what she was feeling. Angry? Scared? Or lonely? As Snow White gets older, the kingdom continues to change. The film tries to show how things have declined under the Queen's rule, but it does this in a pretty minimal way. People wear duller clothing, the village looks more washed out. Eventually, Snow White meets Jonathan, a bandit who's broken into the castle to steal food for his friends. They have a quick, quiet exchange, and he explains just how bad things are in the kingdom. Snow White, clearly naive, seems genuinely shocked. She decides to confront the queen about it, hoping that maybe she can convince her to show a little kindness. Things get even darker when Jonathan is caught by the queen's guards. Snow White pleads with her to show mercy, but the queen orders him to be stripped of his coat and tied up at the palace gates, left to freeze. Snow White, of course, sneaks out to release him. She gives him a piece of bread, they lock eyes, and their hands touch. He's a new character in this version, not a prince, not a classic fairy tale hero. Just a bandit with good intentions, stealing food to feed the hungry. He's kind, grounded, and seems to challenge Snow White in a way no one else in her life does. I think his role is supposed to spark her political awakening. Or maybe the idea is that he represents the people, the ones suffering under the Queen's rule, and Snow White starts realizing she can't just stay quiet anymore. The themes seem to be leaning towards self-awareness, empathy, and stepping into leadership. In short, I didn't dislike him. I just wish the story had done more with him. If they're going to introduce someone totally new into the Snow White universe, give him something meaningful to do. Or at least give us a clearer reason to care. So right around here, the movie decides to follow some more familiar territory. The queen asks her magic mirror who's most admired now. Surprise, it says, Snow White, which of course sends her spiraling. Out of jealousy, she calls on the royal huntsman and orders him to take Snow White into the orchard and kill her. She promises him anything he wants in return. It's a very dramatic setup, and the stakes are supposed to feel high here. But there were a few things about this scene that just didn't fully land for me. First, I really feel like we missed something. There's no moment where the queen lures Snow White into this false sense of safety. Wouldn't it have hit harder if the queen had acted kind, maybe dressed her up, talked about rebuilding trust, or suggested they bake pies together for the villagers, only for it to turn out to be a trap? That kind of fake out could have added emotional weight. But instead it just cuts to the hunt, and it feels abrupt. And then there's the huntsman. He suddenly decides not to kill Snow White because she gives him an apple? I get it. The people are starving, and it's a symbolic moment. But they've never spoken before, and she literally just hands him a piece of fruit. That alone is enough to make him abandon the queen's orders? It's one of those scenes where the emotional logic doesn't quite add up. I think it would have worked better if we'd seen more of the huntsmen struggling beforehand, or if their interaction had more substance. Something small. A conversation, a connection, anything that shows why he hesitates. That said, I did like the small update of him putting an apple in the jeweled box instead of the classic heart of a pig. It was subtle, but a nice touch. What didn't work so well for me was the way Snow White confronts him. He pulls out a dagger, and instead of fear or surprise, she kind of scolds him. Like, "Why are you doing this?" In a way that felt a little too confident. And that's the thing. The movie keeps pushing this theme that Snow White needs to grow into a brave leader. But she already seems incredibly bold from the start. She's stood up to the queen multiple times, freed a prisoner, and now she's talking back to an armed man in the woods. It's hard to believe she still needs to find her strength when she's already showing so much of it early on. So yeah, it's not that these scenes were bad, they just felt like they were trying to force a certain message, even though the character was already living it. After narrowly escaping the huntsman, Snow White flees into the woods. And this is where things finally start to feel more like a fairy tale again. She's guided through the forest by a group of woodland animals who, conveniently, lead her straight to a hidden cottage. This part was a bit odd to me. Snow White walks in without hesitation, heads upstairs, and just falls asleep. No questions asked. No second-guessing whether someone might live there. And maybe that's just fairy tale logic, but it came off a little presumptuous. In the original version, she at least looks around and assumes the place belongs to a group of orphans. And as someone without parents herself, she starts cooking and cleaning as a way to earn her stay. That hesitation and effort to be helpful gave her a certain charm, like she was aware she was intruding and wanted to be respectful. Here, we kind of skip over that completely. There's no sense of worry, no moment of her asking, "Should I even be here?" She just moves in like the lease was already signed. And I get it. They're going for a more self-assured version of the character, but I think a little humility in that moment would have made her more relatable. Soon after, the dwarfs return home from working in the mines. Grumpy is, of course, the first to suggest she leave, but the others warm up to her quickly and let her stay the night. The queen, meanwhile, finds out Snow White is still alive after consulting the magic mirror again. Furious, she locks up the huntsman and sends soldiers into the forest to track Snow White down. Upping the tension, even though it doesn't feel like the queen is quite as menacing as she could be. Back in the cottage, we see Snow White bonding with the dwarfs. And I will say, this was one of the more enjoyable stretches of the movie. The group bickers constantly, which is expected, but there's one detail I really appreciated: the way they treated Dopey. In the original, Dopey is kind of the punching bag of the group. It gets old pretty quickly, and it's honestly a little hard to watch. But here, he gets more love. His dynamic with Snow White is sweet, and you can tell she actually sees him as more than comic relief. Their moments together felt warm and genuine. It's small, but it worked. And in a film where a lot of relationships feel rushed or underdeveloped, that connection stood out in a good way. After settling in with the dwarfs, Snow White makes the decision to go searching for the bandits, the ones who claim to be fighting in the name of the late king. She's starting to step into a more active role here, wanting to help the people and push back against the queen's rule. She ends up running into Jonathan again, and their reunion is a little rocky. He kind of negs her at first, which feels slightly out of place given everything that's happened, but he does help her hide when the queen's soldiers show up. At first, he tells her to run, save herself while she can, but she chooses to come back and help him. And in a dramatic moment, he returns the favor by throwing himself in front of an arrow to protect her. It's meant to solidify their connection. You can tell the film is building towards something more between them. She brings him to Doc, who, despite not being a real doctor, manages to treat his injuries anyway. It's not the most realistic, but hey, it's a fairy tale. The tone shifts lighter again, and the group spends the evening dancing and singing, giving us one of the few truly joyful moments in the whole movie. Then, we finally get the romance beat. Snow White and Jonathan admit their feelings for each other and nearly kiss. But of course, they're interrupted at the last second. Jonathan promises to go find her father, who may still be alive, and Snow White gives him her locket as a token. But just as he sets off, he's captured by the Queen's guards and thrown into the dungeon alongside the huntsman. Meanwhile, the Queen transforms herself into the classic old hag, using magic to disguise herself. She shows up at the dwarf's cottage with a poisoned apple, and this time, she's smart about it. She shows Snow White the locket Jonathan had, pretending they're allies. Snow White, believing the Queen is working with him, lets her guard down and eats the apple. She falls into the famous sleeping death. The dwarfs discover her shortly after, and this part is actually kind of lovely. They don't just place her in a glass coffin, but they bring her to a magical resting place in the forest, surrounded by flowers and soft light. It's probably one of the most visually stunning scenes in the movie. Back in the dungeons, Jonathan and the huntsman manage to escape. Jonathan races through the forest to find Snow White. He arrives and kisses her. She wakes up, just like in the original. Now, to be fair, the kiss didn't feel overly romanticized. Instead, it's framed more as a moment of deep care than a grand romantic gesture. After Snow White wakes up, things move fast. She tries to rally the dwarfs and Jonathan to help her overthrow the queen. At first, they hesitate, but they eventually agree. And this is where the movie makes one of its more interesting choices. Dopey, who hasn't spoken a word the entire film, suddenly speaks. And not just a word, he gives a full-on motivational speech. Now, to be fair, the movie does hint earlier that his mutism is tied to confidence and not something physical. But still, it felt jarring. I was totally fine with him expressing himself through whistling or gestures, but having him suddenly break out a whole sentence in a big dramatic moment just didn't feel true to the version of the character we'd been watching. Anyway, with the dwarfs and Jonathan on board, Snow White marches toward the castle. The villagers see her and quickly rally to her side, which also felt a bit convenient, but I'll let it slide for fairy tale logic. Then we get the final showdown. Snow White confronts the queen in front of the palace, and the queen tries to push her into violence, handing her a dagger and daring her to strike. But Snow White refuses. Instead, she starts naming every single one of the queen's soldiers one by one, wins them over. It's meant to show that Snow White sees them as people, that she remembers them, values them, and they respond by switching sides. It's a cool idea in theory, but the moment doesn't feel fully earned. We barely know these soldiers, and we don't really understand why remembering their names suddenly changes everything. The queen tries one last time to kill Snow White, using a magical dagger which immediately crumbles into dust. Everyone celebrates like the fight is over, but the queen runs back to her magic mirror. And this part gets even murkier. The mirror tells her that Snow White will always be the fairest, because she's kind and just. Which sounds nice, but also makes you wonder, if kindness was the standard the whole time, why was the queen ever considered fairest to begin with? It kind of undermines the setup. The queen smashes the mirror in rage, and is then sucked into it, which implies her magic came from the mirror itself. Again, interesting in concept, but not clearly established in the rest of the film. The magic rules feel very vague throughout. And then we wrap things up with the kingdom celebrating Snow White and Jonathan's marriage. They dance, they smile, we get a sweeping shot of the palace, and boom, happily ever after. And look, I'm not against happy endings, especially in a movie like this. But it all wrapped up a little too quickly and cleanly, considering how much buildup there was. There were a lot of plot threads that didn't go anywhere, and a few characters that probably didn't need to be there at all. The pacing just felt off. Like it was trying to be epic and fast-moving at the same time and ended up stuck somewhere in the middle. So now that we've walked through the entire movie, here are my honest thoughts. First, I get what Disney was trying to do. They wanted to take a classic fairy tale and give it a more modern spin. They tried to make Snow White stronger, more self-driven, more politically aware. They introduced new characters, added darker undertones, and leaned into themes of justice and leadership. That's not a bad idea in itself. But the execution? It just didn't hold together. The biggest issue for me was the pacing. The movie jumped from one plot point to the next without giving most of them time to develop. Emotional moments were rushed, character arcs felt half-finished, and scenes that were supposed to feel epic or moving did not deliver. If they were going to change the story this much, here's what I think would have made it more effective. First of all, to focus on fewer characters. There were too many side characters who didn't add much to the story. Trimming the cast could have made more room for Snow White and Jonathan to develop real chemistry, or for the dwarfs to feel more distinct and meaningful. Build Snow White's arc more gradually. If the goal was to show her growing into a fearless leader, she needed to start from a more vulnerable place. She was already confident and brave from the very beginning, which made the growth feel unearned. Giving her more doubt or fear early on would have made her transformation feel more powerful. Give Jonathan a stronger purpose. He wasn't a bad character, but he didn't really drive the story. Was he a love interest? A symbol of the rebellion? A reflection of the people's struggles? The movie never really decided. If they wanted him to matter, they needed to give him clearer stakes and more active involvement in Snow White's journey. Clarify the Queen's magic and motivations. The mirror's rules were vague, and the Queen's descent felt inconsistent. If her power came from the mirror, why didn't we know that sooner? If she was obsessed with admiration, why was beauty still such a focus? The movie needed to pick a lane and stick to it. Let the themes breathe. The ideas were there: courage, compassion, remembering the people you lead. But the movie didn't slow down enough to let those messages land. A few more quiet moments, a few more scenes showing relationships growing or stakes rising, could have gone a long way. And lastly, trust the audience. Not everything needs to be explained in dialogue. Not every emotional beat needs dramatic music. Let the characters tell the story through action, through growth. If you want to modernize a fairy tale, that's totally fine. Just don't forget the heart that made it memorable in the first place. So yeah, Snow White had potential, but it just didn't stick the landing. If you saw it and felt the same, or if you totally disagree with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. We all watch movies through different lenses, and that's what makes the conversation fun. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more honest movie recaps, reviews, and the occasional deep dive into Hollywood chaos, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.